Welcome to Reading Dungeons & Dragons Aloud with Dr. Scott M. Bruner, Ben Riggs, and this week's special guest, Professor Christopher Robichaud. Today's episode, D&D should be more like reading, less like playing Risk. Good morning, one and all. Good morning once again. It is I, controversial D&D gadfly Ben Riggs, and with me, as always, is the one, the only, a teacher in the streets, and a GM if you have the character sheets, Dr. Scott Bruner.
Good morning.
Wow.
And I was thinking about that one all week. And joining us again for the second week in a row to continue discussing vampires in D&D, we have Harvard's own Dr. Christopher Robichaud.
Hello.
So last week, obviously, we went over the first edition vampire, and we kind of got into combat as sports versus combat as war, but we did not get into the 5e vampire, which I believe you specifically wanted to contrast, Professor. Is that right?
Yeah, I thought it would be interesting for us, to sort of look at what's changed over the decades, and if we really want to be pedantic about it, maybe during our conversation we can go through all the editions and how they've changed. But I thought it would be nice bookends to see the first edition and now the 5th edition up to the new monster manual that I guess is coming out in early 2025.
Yeah, sounds good to me. Do you want to read it? Should I read it? Who wants to read it?
Well, I thought I read the last one, so I thought either you or Scott should have at it for this one, if that's okay.
Scott, you want to do it or should I?
I can do it.
Okay, cool, man.
I was trying to find my cough button. I couldn't find it. All right, are we reading? So I've got vampire up. Do we want to read the flavor text, or do we want to read just the?
I think you should read the flavor text because I like the flavor.
All right, you guys are asking me to this is like my. If I've not mentioned it already, I have a distaste for vampires. Zombies are by far the more. The better undead creature. Vampires awakened to an endless night. Vampires hunger for the life they have lost and sate that hunger by drinking the blood of the living. Vampires abhor sunlight, for its touch burns them. They never cast shadows or reflections, and any vampire wishing to move unnoticed among the living keeps to the darkness and far from reflective surfaces. Dark desires. Whether or not a vampire retains any memories from its former life, its emotional attachments wither as once pure feelings become twisted by undeath. Love turns into hungry obsession while friendship becomes bitter jealousy. In place of emotion, vampires pursue physical symbols of what they crave so that a vampire seeking love might fixate on a young beauty. A child might become an object of fascination for a vampire obsessed with youth and potential. Hard not to think about Interview with a Vampire when I read that.
Mm-hmm.
Others surround themselves with art, books, or sinister items such as torture devices or trophies from creatures they have killed. Born from death, most of a vampire's victims become vampire spawn, ravenous creatures with a vampire's hunger for blood, but under the control of the vampire that created them. If a true vampire allows a spawn to draw blood from its own body, the spawn transforms into a true vampire no longer under its master's control. Few vampires are willing to relinquish their control in this manner. Vampire spawn become free-willed when their creator dies, chained to the grave. Every vampire remains bound to its coffin, crypt, or grave site where it must rest by day. If a vampire didn't receive a formal burial, it must lie beneath a foot of earth at the place of its transition to undeath. A vampire can move its place of burial by transporting its coffin or a significant amount of grave dirt to another location. Some vampires set up multiple resting places this way. Undead nature. Neither a vampire nor a vampire spawn requires air. And I'm going to read, this is kind of interesting. There's actually a small little sidebar on player characters as vampires. Really quickly, the game statistics of a player character transformed into a vampire spawn and then a vampire don't change, except that the character's strength, dexterity, and constitution score become 18 if they aren't higher. In addition, the character gains the vampire's damage resistance, dark vision traits, and actions. Attack and damage rolls for the vampire's attacks are based on strength. The save DC for charm is 8 plus the vampire's proficiency bonus plus the vampire's charisma modifier. The character's alignment becomes lawful evil, and the DM might take control of the character until the vampirism is reversed with a wish spell, or the character is killed and brought back to life. The next section is about a vampire's lair, and then of course we have the large stat block. I'm just going to quickly go through it. But a vampire is a medium undead, shape changer, lawful evil, armor class 16, 144, which I always thought was actually kind of small. 144 hit points, speed 30 feet. The They have, let's see, I'm just going to go through they're shape changers. They have legendary resistance, misty escape, regeneration, spider climb. Of course, they're weak against running water, a stake to the heart, which I think this is interesting, is in stake to the heart. If a piercing weapon made of wood is driven into the vampire's heart while the vampire is incapacitated in its resting place, the vampire is paralyzed until the stake is removed. I know this because I'm currently running Curse of Strahd, and my party just fought Strahd for the first time. And I read that, and I was like, it's interesting that a stake to the heart doesn't kill a vampire, it only paralyzes it. Quickly, the actions that a vampire can take, because they do have multi-attack, they can take 2 attacks, only one of which can be a bite. We have unarmed strike, bite, charm, this ability, Children of the Night, which means they can summon bats or rats. And then, of course, a vampire also gets 3 legendary actions, which is just move, unarmed strike, and bite. So there's your 5e vampire. Voila.
Yay.
Woohoo!
I do think it's funny, Scott, because you mentioned it last week as well that you don't prefer vampires, but that you're running Curse of Strahd.
Well, it is. I mean, it's interesting. We're talking about WotC and talking about that we're kind of be mean to WotC. It is the best 5e adventure.
100%. 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. I will say this though, I've been running because if anybody knows my games, they tend to take a while. I really lean into often like building themes and stuff. So this is a every other week game, and it's now been going on probably about 14 months, and we're probably about 60% through.
Oh wow, I also drag out games sometimes, just getting everyone to the table and so forth. I played Curse of Strahd twice with 2 different groups because of how much I love it. I did Before we get into 5e Vampire, though, I did want to ask because it's kind of cool. I remember you mentioned last time we spoke last week that it was going to be the party's first introduction to Strahd. How did that go? That's always a fun moment.
Ah, man, isn't it? I'm laughing because it's like one of the things that I think is so funny about Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop role-playing games, and here's that digression, is if you have ever read, I'm sure obviously all of us have read quite a bit of people writing about Dungeons and Dragons. I don't think there is a single analytic or academic book about Dungeons and Dragons where the writer is able to resist talking about their own campaign. And there's something about that. I mean, that's a whole nother digression.
Yeah.
But every time you start talking about your campaigns, you're like, how do I tell people my campaign without boring folks? But to answer your question as quickly as possible, it went kind of strange. I'm hoping that my group isn't listening to this right now, but the whole concept of introducing Strahd in the game early is so that folks know how powerful he is, and so it's supposed to be like a humbling experience, right? And it wasn't entirely a humbling experience. He's very powerful. I mean, he could have easily. And in fact, I threw 12 wolves at them to soften them up, and then I threw him at him, and they didn't have like any spells. They didn't have much left. But I created this one magic item that is the kind of and I create a lot of stuff on the spot. I created this one item that can be used to kill any creature once, but if you do, basically you lose your soul. And they used it to threaten Strahd. And in the middle of the encounter, I was like, okay, well, that would actually kill Strahd. I made this item. I'm going to go with it. But how do I still make this kind of fit Strahd? And so what I had to do is I had to make Strahd actually want them to use it on him. And my thought was, if they use it, I'm going to make the player character become Strahd, and we're going to keep going. But now he's going to have to flip over to a new character. Again, I hope they're not listening to that because that didn't happen. I just had Strahd run away, but it wasn't exactly what I expected. To answer your question,
I love that improvisation. I mean, given Ravenloft, I mean, I when I run it, I often have Strahd sort of seeking oblivion at some points as well because he can't escape, he can't get out.
Mm-hmm.
I think to put it to what we were talking about, a big congratulations to Hickman for coming up with a module that really took the old vampire and made it into a thing.
I wish they had done like a series. Like it's interesting when Pathfinder was getting its legs under it and when it was becoming bigger than Dungeons and Dragons, they came out with a book called I think it's called Misfit Monsters Revisited or Resaved or something. And I have it, and it's such a great little. It's actually right behind me. And it's such a great little book because what they had done is they had taken. It's funny because now they've come right back into the mainstream. But things like the Flumph or like really flail snails, kind of some of the stranger monsters, and they gave them like 3-page write-ups on how to use them and why they're so fantastic, right?
Absolutely.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, but what I was going to say is it would have been it's I almost wish there were more modules where Hickman or whomever had sat down and been like, let's have an entire adventure on. I mean, you could certainly do something with an Illithid, right? You could have an entire adventure on just an Illithid coming. I haven't played Baldur's Gate, so maybe that's exactly what Baldur's Gate is. But there's so many fantastic monsters. It'd be wonderful if we had like a series of modules just on an entire adventure around them
Yes.
because they're all so rich. I mean, there's something so what Gary Gygax gets a lot of grief these days. I was thinking about
What
this
do you
just
mean?
and some of it's rather deserved. Don't get me wrong. Also, very
You
much a
really did
product of
step.
it.
You stepped in it, Ben. Was it a few months ago? That was yeah. So
Please continue.
I just and so much. There's something so wonderful about how he remixed classic mythology and classic beasts like the vampire into its own mythology, which I find so fascinating. And now we take it for granted. And I just mentioned the flump. Probably every listener knows exactly what I'm talking about. What a strange thing to create, and yet, again, this I don't know if you call it a remix or a postmodern collage of mythology and folklore into something new, but it's beautiful. Like I love the cosmology and mythology that Dungeons and Dragons created in the 1970s, and I think I think it's brilliant.
there's I think just being released now is WizKids 50th anniversary miniature sets. And I'm not a huge miniature person, but I have my eye on some of them just because it's a lot of they go across the editions, but a lot of them are miniatures of those old Monster Manual pictures. And like you said, just sort of the way that they were even pictorially represented in older editions resonates for me. It's its own world. It took stuff from other worlds, but it built its own world with them.
And there's something to say that the nostalgia is there. Like these things are so embedded with kind of our early imagination. I mean, in many ways, this is the first way that a lot of us actually came to understand what monsters kind of were was through Dungeons and Dragons. So it's funny to me that they are not archetypes simply because he was, from Tolkien, from Norse mythology, all of these places that Gygax was pulling from. At the same time, they've become kind of their own thing. Now, for us, they kind of are the archetype. But I do think it's more than just nostalgia. I do think it's really, really interesting. And one of the things that struck me as I was reading The Vampire is it's so interesting that you have to. Of course, this isn't Gygax, but Gygax would have done it when last week when we were reading the first edition version of The Vampire, is how you have to is the translation of a mythic beast into a ludic form. I find so interesting. Here's a question for the group. Does it lose anything? When we read a monster from the perspective of this is its digital makeup, these are the numbers that provide what it can do, is that as interesting as reading about a vampire in a novel? What is it like? How many of us grew up reading the Monster Manual for fun?
You want
Oh,
to
I
go first, Professor? Go ahead.
yeah,
Go ahead.
I was going to say I love this question, and it speaks to and Ben, I promise we'll come back to the fifth edition vampire.
We're here for the digressions.
Yeah, but I regularly will, and I think this is somewhat of an answer to your question, not a complete answer to your question, because I read the Monster Manual all the time. I actually relax. One of my most therapeutic things to do is to read through Monster Manual, just read through monsters and see the thing. But I will regularly throw curveballs at my players by tweaking monsters that they're familiar fighting. And that is just to try to convey the mystery again a little bit. The idea that you can't capture what this thing is that you're fighting just by having its stats memorized or by knowing its weaknesses. Because I do agree with you, Scott, or at least I want to pull on the thread that you introduced, which is once you reduce these ancient sort of foes to here's its strength and here's its weaknesses and here's its charm capability and all the rest of it, it does lose something. Trying to bring that into play, though, I always try to throw my players a little bit of curveballs. The monsters that they fight are always vampire asterisk, dragon asterisk, the asterisk representing that I've probably changed it a little bit to just make it an interesting encounter that they haven't fought before.
So, you're asking about taking a mythological monster and translating him into a role-playing game, correct? Or her into a role-playing game?
Yeah, translate. Well,
Yeah.
it's in some ways it's almost a translation from the analog to the digital. I think in some ways, like from the from the imaginary, from a an abstract concept of what it is into literally ones and zeros. Now we know. Now we know. I mean, this gives. Sorry, but I didn't mean. But it's
It's okay.
interesting to me because we've talked about how much grief some of the these systems have. What about the what was it called? Not legend. It became legends and lore, but what deities and demigods? Like
Yeah.
they did literally. Gygax and crew did that for actual gods, which got them in trouble. They're like, this is exactly what the strength of Zeus is. Do we lose anything in that digitization of monsters?
So I mean, I don't know that anything is. I mean, at the table, I mean, if you're going to have Dracula at the table, you're going to have to give him stats. And I suppose that there is as the professor said, a mystery that is lost and a wonder that is lost in doing that. But again, hopefully the players don't see it. It's just
Right.
the DM that's like, oh, Satan has this many hit points. Okay.
333 we learned last
Yeah.
week.
Yeah.
That said, I would certainly say that uh, the lore claims of the D&D vampire are just as valid as the lore claims of a novel. Um, and you can see that, I think, most explicitly in Vampire the Masquerade and Charlene Harris's True Blood books. Are you guys familiar with Charlene Harris's True Blood books at all?
I am, yeah.
I'm not.
So, very long story short, Charlene Harris, wrote a series of essentially vampire and mystery romance novels that are very, very engaging and delightful. It was made into the TV show True Blood, starring Joe Manganiello, everyone's favorite D&D celebrity. But it's impossible to read those books and not be like, this is almost a total translation or theft of the Vampire the Masquerade setting and world. Um, it's amazing how close Charlene Harris's work is to that. And my recollection is she said that she played the game and she was influenced by it. So even though D&D takes the vampire and puts it into a game, the changes that it makes to the vampire, I believe, are just as valid as anything that would be done in a novel. And I would love if one of you could correct me on this, but I certainly like into my mind, the introduction of romance to the Dracula plot comes in Ravenloft. Uh, Maybe somebody else did it beforehand, but I don't know about it, and it's not in Bram Stoker's Dracula. There is no like uh, there's no Lucy Westenra is or Lucy or no, it was Mina. Which one died? Do you guys remember?
It's Lucy who dies.
Lucy dies. So Mina
In
Harker. There we go.
Spoiler.
in the novels, in the book, the old they switched those Mina and Lucy in the old edition and the old versions of Dracula, but Bram Stoker's Dracula switches them back. Lucy
Okay,
survives in like 19. I'm sorry, I know my Dracula movies probably too well, but
that's
Lucy's
okay.
the one who survives in like 1979 Dracula, Bela Lugosi Dracula, but they eventually get it back. Anyways, this is
Anyway,
totally
so but Mina Harker is the one that survives, and it has like a psychic link with vampire with Dracula in the novel, right?
right.
Okay,
Right.
good. So extemporaneously talking about Dracula, but I feel like I've read it enough. I should be able to do okay on this. Um, there's no romance between Mina and Dracula. Again, it feels like a rape plot in many ways. And the vampire is a mythologized monster of rape. Um, and I don't know that romance was introduced until the Hickmans put it in there in Ravenloft, which is also odd because one of the reasons they did it, they said, is they wanted to make the vampire a horrible monster again, but they kind of humanized Strahd, which they're very famous for. So ultimately, Scott, I would just tell you that I think the most important thing to realize is there's no uh, there's no aesthetic difference between uh, Francis Ford Coppola making his movie and Bram Stoker writing his novel and the Hickmans writing Ravenloft. Both are playing with the stuff of mythology. Uh, if anything, it's just cool that D&D allows everybody to play with the stuff of mythology and democratizes that, man. Meme?
Sure,
What do you call
yeah.
Dracula? Legend?
Do
That
we
god? Demigod?
sure? Do we lose anything though when we know exactly what they can do?
Oh
When
yeah.
is any of the mystery lost when it's no longer like you know when we know specifically what a vampire can actually do in a round rather than like who knows what the vampire can do? It's kind of interesting, and
Yeah,
I'm
but
not
only for the
yeah
DM, I think.
yeah
And
that's a
until
good
the
point.
players
Yeah,
learn it.
I
that's a
think, this I think will pull us back to the combat as sport. But two things. The first is one thing that Dungeons and Dragons does because of the kind of game that it is. It's not a criticism, just an observation. Is many of these monsters, we'll take the vampires as an example, when we've encountered them in film or in fiction, interrupt the ordinary, right? It's an ordinary world, and now there's a vampire, right? Now I know that urban fantasy sort of breaks with this, but the thought is, it's an ordinary world, and now there's a werewolf. It's an ordinary world. The point being is that typically the fictions or many of the fictions, Stephen King is famous for this, right? It's really an ordinary world, but now here's this, cackling demonic, not even demonic, sort of extra
Alien clown.
alien clown, right? Extra guy. In Dungeons and Dragons, the vampire is just one of hundreds and hundreds of monsters, right? It's the monsters are everywhere. In some ways the vampire is the norm. It's just the next sort
yeah.
of nasty that you're turning a corner to encounter, and that I think can take some of the mystery away from some of these classic sort of creatures, because it is just another thing to fight. Often is really the fifth edition spirit of it. No matter what, at the end of the day, it's just another encounter to be won.
Yeah, it's. I think I probably made this joke on the show before, but I always think about like what an entirely dangerous world it is to go camping in, like the Forgotten Realms. Like, if you consider like all of these monsters from kobolds to goblins to rot grubs to giant spiders
Right,
exist out there, like
right.
really you're gonna want to stay home. They always thought it was interesting. Like Pathfinder, I would mention Pathfinder. They have like they with the first edition of Pathfinder, there were like three bestiaries. I'm like, my God, how does all of these things fit in one world? But I suppose it's something interesting and that's I mean that's a fascinating topic alone is thinking about the player characters existing in a world where fantasy becomes mundane, right? I think
Scott,
you're
you have brainstormed your way to the perfect D&D starter set. Like it's Forgotten Realms Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts or whatever it is, and it's, okay, well, so if a vampire attacks the camp kids, here's what we're gonna do.
I can't even imagine the Swiss Army knife in the Forgotten Realms. He's like part. I don't even know what you like. One's a Vorpal sword, and then this one over here is a.
Right.
You've got a flask of oil, and then another. What looks like a 10-foot pole on your little thing.
I
But
mean,
it is
it's a
interesting,
perfect. You could do that's a novel, Scott.
right?
Your
Yeah.
literary career has started.
But I do want us to, if it's okay, bring us to this fifth
Let's do it.
edition vampire, because now we sort of with the like encounter to be bested, let's just notice and we sort of reveal this last conversation that we had, but there is no level drain in this stat
Yeah.
block.
Yeah.
There is instead, this notion of a kind of necrotic health drain when you look into the details. With this edition, a couple of things. The first is for the vampire to be able to drain you at all, it's already got to it already has to succeed on a hit and use that hit to grapple you. So when you're looking into the details of the fifth edition,
Yeah.
it can only do it with its bite, and then if the bite gets you, the fifth edition's solution to the problem of how do we sort of capture some of this drain is, well, you lose some number of necrotic, you take some necrotic hit points of damage, and then your total hit points go down. And if your total hit points go down to zero, you die. Much less nasty than the early editions. And I'll just plug here. I did do my homework over the week. I looked at like the third edition, from 3.5 and Pathfinder, and
Wow.
they had the Constitution damage and Constitution
Yeah.
drain and negative levels, but it was all pretty nasty as well. It was all pretty ugly. I think they made it a little bit simpler to calculate on the fly, but at the end of the day, and then fourth edition, in classic fourth edition fashion, got rid of all of it. There's none of this in any form in the fourth edition. There's not even a Ravenloft. Ravenloft has been translated into every edition from first through fifth except fourth edition. However, asterisk, there's the Ravenloft board game,
Which is very, very good.
which is wonderful, right? And I might be misspeaking, and there might be something lurking in like the online dungeons or something like that did it. But in terms of an actual module, they did it for 1E, they did it for 2E, they did it for 3E. But here we have a different kind of level drain. My thing, though, with this vampire is one, I think there's been a lot of ink spilled, as it were, over the past decade, wondering whether this really is a challenge level 13
Yeah.
monster. Because I certainly know many parties that don't have to be that powerful to really just kick its butt, and they do not need to be 13th level or anything near 13th level to be able to do that. But the other thing is, a lot of the horror of a vampire sure seems to me has been taken away here. And I think, Scott, to speak to your point, I mean, at the end of the day, at least when you had level drain, there was a kind of horror to it. It may not have been
Yeah.
the horror from the books, but now it's just like, all right, I've lost some hit points. Don't worry. One long rest brings back all of those negatively drained hit points. So I just need a good night's sleep, and my encounter with the vampire will be done. And this is great for combat as sport. It's a kind of a catastrophe if you want to capture any of that combat as war component in your 5e adventure.
I was
It's it.
reading. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, go ahead. Go, Ben. You're good.
I was reading Halls of the Blood King for Old School Essentials yesterday, which is
Uh,
a a vampire king transports his mansion to your village, and it's bad. So you need to go kill the vampire king. And I was rereading the Old School Essentials stats, and they keep the level drain, but they also offered options for replacing it. But having spent the last week kind of having the vampire and level drain sitting in the back of my brain, despite how horrible and unfair that attack is, it does do a good job of simulating in game the I don't want to deal with a vampire. That sounds terrible and horrible, and in some ways it's worse than it's worse than death. Maybe, you might prefer a character to die than be knocked down like 4 levels. Um, at least if you had to make a new character, hopefully you make it at the same level. So again, going back to that translation, I think it's effective, and I think that you're correct that something is lost by not having level drain as an attack here. Scottius Maximus.
So, sorry. It's, I mean, I think the criticism is almost in many ways leveled less necessarily at the vampire and the monster man as much as a 5e as a whole, right? 5e was kind of made to be accessible. It's interesting because we're talking about, digital translations of kind of mythologies. And I think one of the things that I think we're discovering as we kind of talk through this vampire thing is that seeing that one of the philosophies of 5e is very much as combat as sport. It's very much, it's board gamey in many ways. The vampire is definitely meant to be defeated at some point, where if you were going to defeat a first edition vampire, you were not going to do it. You're not going to do it. I don't want to say through the rules, but necessarily through the traditional combat. You weren't just going to go round. We hit the vampire back, hits back. You were going to have some way that you were going to use everything at your disposal in the environment. Or you were going to use everything in your environment to avoid the vampire entirely. But this vampire is obviously meant to be defeated. There's a reason that. And as soon as you bring up the Pathfinder stuff, I can't stop thinking about how much I always loathe the way that they did you could drain specific abilities, and then you had to quickly think about how that changed your modifiers, and that was such a pain in the butt.
it really was.
It's amazing how much we loved Pathfinder. I mean, no offense, Pies, I still love Pathfinder. Of course, there's a reason there's a second edition Pathfinder. But yeah, it is interesting, and I think this again, the vampire is more a symptom of the core philosophy of 5e, which is that they want you to fight monsters in the way that you do combat in the game, right? You defeat a vampire by going round by round by round. And I there's a reason that I prefer the first edition to the fifth edition. I absolutely prefer combat as war, probably because I want to get as close as I can to the experience of actually feeling like you're jumping into the Laramie mythology of a lot of these things. And I don't. Can you think of a single, we've already talked about the Coppola movies or any of these things. Anytime if vampire was defeated, it certainly wasn't done in round by round combat, right? It was always about somebody tricking the vampire or finding, and of course, I mean, the vampire does have there's two huge weaknesses that kind of need to be exploited. One that, rests, underground, during the day. And two, yeah, you can neutralize a vamp. Does anybody make anything of the fact that the stake through the heart only paralyzes it and doesn't kill it?
Well, to me, rules wise, it almost might as well, right? Because once you're incapacitated, if I'm remembering my 5e rules on paralyzed and incapacitated, once you're incapacitated, any hit against any melee hit, for instance, against the vampire is going to be a critical hit.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and I think so. And you basically have shut the thing down because it can't remove the stake on its own. If I'm remembering that correctly, if you are paralyzed and incapacitated, it's different than being restrained. You can't do anything. So, uh, I for all to me and for all intents and purposes, if you've actually succeeded in that, you've I was about to say nailed it, but that seems wrong.
It's
What's wrong?
interesting.
It's
Yeah.
perfect.
It's interesting. You can kill a vampire by just taking it. I'm looking at regeneration. So a vampire is going to regain 20 hit points, but only if it has 1 hit point. So you can kill a vampire by doing by just taking it to 0 hit points, which again is different than the mythology, right? I mean, in the mythology, you've got to stake a vampire, if I'm not mistaken, like or put it in the sun. Those are the only two ways to kill it, to
Well, and
to
in
truly
this
kill it,
edition
right?
too, I think I have to review it, but it has this regenerative capacity, but it only works if it doesn't take radiant damage. So, and again, this could be a combat as war, right? The party really prepares itself to do radiant damage to this thing so that it doesn't heal. But the truth of the matter is, by the time you're fighting a vampire, there's almost always going to be multiple PCs who ordinarily have, can do radiant damage, which really takes away that power. I know we all probably sound grouchy about this, and I guess maybe this is the question I'd love to ask us because I wrestle with it all the time. Um, and it is about fifth edition, which is really what the conversation was meant to bring us into the different editions. As a player,
Can I
as a
throw out
kid,
one? Sorry, I found
yeah,
the section in Dracula where Van Helsing is describing killing a vampire. May I read it really quick?
sure, of course.
So this is I can't for 27th September. Quote, therefore I write in this case, take the papers that are with this, the diaries of Harker and the rest, and read them, and then find this great undead, and cut off his head, and burn his heart, or drive a stake through it, so that the world may rest from him, if it be so, farewell, Van Helsing. So it is interesting that at least in Bram Stoker's Dracula, if we're going to take that as our text here, uh, it is not just driving a stake through the heart. You also got to do the head, uh, and perhaps the burning of the heart. There's more to it than just the stake. So I guess you could say that D&D does have some literary background for requiring more than the stake through the heart. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Professor.
No, no, no. I'm glad that you found that passage. That's great. Uh, I guess I was just gonna say, I started playing D&D. I'm very much a Stranger Things kid, as it were. That's how I describe myself. So I started playing it in the 80s. I came into it really right when Dragonlance was taking off, right when Ravenloft was taking off, right when it was clearly pivoting from the first decade of play, which was, I think, sort of the heart of combat as war. And playing it through the second edition, I will be the first to admit that both as a dungeon master, but also as a player, the people I played with, my friends who I still play with, we did want the capacity to, go toe to toe with monsters a little bit more. We did like as the edition gave
Yeah.
us a little bit more of a power set to play with. I've often described D&D 5e 2014 as the spiritual successor to 2e, in that it sort of took some of its nods from the second edition, kits and things like that, and just did it a lot better. But I can't help but think now that the pendulum has swung pretty far in the other direction, where that desire to have some combat at sport has been replaced with it's all combat as sport. And I guess one of the things, this may be a confessional, it's a Dungeon Master confessional. One of the things I struggle with is all my players love 5e, and I speak the language enough so that I'm staying with 5e. How do I strike that balance? How do I use this system to give the combat as sport 3/4 of the time, but 1/4 of the time maybe to still sort of bring back that old school idea of no, you're in over your head and you're not going to defeat this thing with your power set, where that doesn't end up being a bummer given the nature of the game. You know.
I mean, one of the things that has occurred to me in this discussion is uh I would love to read a history of D&D, not of the creators and not of the products, but a history of D&D as it is actually played.
Hmm.
Uh, and I it's a thing I'm gonna have to think about because when you say that, the first 10 years were combat as war and then Dragonlance began switching us to combat as sport, it makes a ton of sense. And again, my question, like, we don't need to talk about this right now, but my question was going to be, is the switch to combat as sport a reason for the success of 5e? Because my gut is going to tell me that it is. Again, when I talk to people and they're like, my bard from New Jersey, I think the fact that like they can have a reasonable expectation that their bard will survive combat encounters and they come back next week and they're still that bard and they're telling that bard's story and death ends the story even though it adds reality to the world and the combat situations. Like those things are at cross purposes. And I guess that is the question that you're asking, Professor, because you're asking how is it that you can keep having the story told most of the time, but every once in a while it's Verdun, and you better watch out because this one's for real. Um, I will confess that I last week went and played the ran the Morkborg version of Cyberpunk with my group, Cyborg,
Yeah.
and it was kind of a disaster. Um, like,
That is not combat as sport. Merkborg is not
it is
combat as
not
sport.
combat as
Yeah.
sport. They were supposed to a deathmatch player stole a pair of cybernetic legs from a guy, and their job was to go and get the cybernetic legs back from the deathmatch player. And he's having a party. So they go to the front door, they kill the guards, and they try to open the door. And the people in the party, of course, slam down a steel door and call the Pinkertons. We're like, yeah, the Pinkertons are still a thing here, and he has a contract with the Pinkertons. And now a Pinkerton SWAT team is coming up the stairs, and they're like, and they have a moment where they're like, let's destroy the elevator. And I'm like, your means of escape? What is happening here?
Yeah.
And I kind of am we're supposed to keep going tomorrow, and I'm like, I don't know what to do because the thing I probably should do here is kill you. But we've been playing this game for like 2 hours,
Right.
and I don't know, man. So I guess I would tell you, Professor, from my personal experience, at least this week, I don't feel like I have a great answer to the question of how do you negotiate those differences. I'm like, you know, should I have said, "Are you sure you want to do that a few more times?" I don't know. Maybe I didn't do enough to create expectations at the table beforehand. But I was so looking forward to this too, and then it just blows up in my face. Haven't had something blow up in a while, so that was kind of fun. But I'm
I've been
sorry,
thinking I've been
it's a
thinking a
long
lot.
non-answer.
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot, and I hope this isn't too much of a digression, but I've been thinking a lot about consequence role-playing games. It's funny you were talking about, being a Stranger Things kid, and I suppose that's not a bad way to describe myself. One of the things that I remember when we were kids and we would do a dungeon, we never thought that our characters would necessarily survive. We did view it more as kind of, sometimes I do think of like the old school text adventure games or even the graphic, Sierra Online type adventure games where like we may all die or, we never thought all the characters were going to get through it. And I still specifically remember, I don't know what dungeon it was. It was probably one of the GDQ series. When a player died when we were kids, that kid like just hung out. Like it's like it didn't play anymore. Like it's funny to me now. Like if somebody dies and they're like, okay, quickly roll up a character on the side and we'll
Figure it
definitely
out.
put them chained
Yeah.
to the wall, manacled
Yeah.
in a dungeon that they're going, and we'll bring them right down in. But when we were kids, that kid was like, sorry, dude, you should have played better. And then they would go home, which I find interesting. But the thing I've been thinking a lot about consequence in my games because my games are fairly lethal, and I have no problem with that. I find it much more interesting, and I feel like it undergirds the type of worlds that I want to create, which they are. um, I I'm running Shadow Dark right now for a group that has only played 5e, and it's been interesting because I very much said this is going to be different than necessarily playing 5e. This game is lethal. It's very much a game of attrition. Who knows? And I said one of the things is I'm not going to give you a percentage, but unless you play your cards really well in this, it's possible that you are not going to succeed or not what you would think is what you would think of success, defeating the monster, getting all the loot. Like there's a kind of strange little the monster's got a wonderfully strange motivation for being there, and it's also way more powerful than you to begin with, so we'll see what happens, which I find more interesting. But what I think a lot about is how you create consequence in tabletop role-playing games where you can't stop people from playing. You can't do that thing where you're like, okay, your character's dead, now go sit on the side. We don't do that. That wouldn't that's unfair. But I do feel there should be some negative con by the way, all of my party completely the party almost all my players are like, why are you so mean? I always think there should be some negative consequence to players going to, it doesn't have to be, you should still be able to play, but I always think one of the things I've done is if a player dies, or excuse me, no, the players are fine. My games are not that
Oh
lethal.
my
If
God,
a
Scott!
I was
it's
like,
not,
yeah, it's
I'm gonna
rough.
I'm
it
gonna
is.
call the
At
Wauwatosa
your
Police
table.
Department right
You're not
now.
playing at OSR if you can't, if you enter my game, you've got to be prepared. No, if a character dies, I usually let players create a new character, but it's always but what we used to do with the 1E game was you would create a new player character one level below the mean of the current party.
Nice. Yeah.
And I still don't love that. I don't, what do you guys think? I mean, is death just something? Because I feel like this has been something I have been struggling with now for like a year on how you create consequence. And what I find interesting, this is how I'm different than all my players. This is one of the reasons why I think I like DMing. I don't mean to ramble so much. Why I like DMing more than playing is I always find it so fascinating when I see players get so, and I see it all the time. They get nervous, or they get anxious about their characters, or they really get involved in what's going on. Whenever I play, I always have a crazy distance with my player character. I like them and they're fun, but I do tend to view them as pieces. My point is, where I don't think there is consequence, I think my players do, and I think it's one of the reasons why there's sometimes friction of some of my groups. I'm like, well, okay, this happened. We've got to have some consequence. We've got to have this impact the story, and I want to, you know what I want? I want it to be something that players are actively trying to avoid.
I'm turning 46 tomorrow, so I have some thoughts about death.
A very happy birthday to you.
Thank
46
Yeah.
you.
till 40s. I'm 50. So
Ah,
you don't get to say you're when you get to say you've lived half a century, that's when you truly feel old. Scott, to answer your question, I also run pretty lethal 5e games, so and my players, the players who stick with me are the ones that eventually make peace with that. But the
Yeah.
consequence thing is hard. I ran a multi-year Tomb of Annihilation campaign, and I actually liked Tomb of Annihilation compared to some of the stuff that WotC's put out. Per usual, I kept 1/3 of it and I made 2/3 of it my own
Huh.
thing. But I ended up with a very gimmicky, but it ended up worked consequence system. And I say gimmicky because it was meta. I'm not going to deny that it wasn't meta. Because the players I wanted to have lethality, but it was also the case that, they were getting pretty high in levels. They were going through this. And so even if a character died, one thing about fifth edition is death doesn't really mean death. When you've got Revivify as the level 3
Sure.
spell, when
Yeah.
you've got Raise that, there's just so many ways to bring characters back.
Yeah.
But I ran it so that they were in a place where that every time their character died, for that brief moment, it made the thing that was growing underneath this thing that much more powerful. And at first it was very abstract, but then, the dungeon started rumbling more. And the players eventually caught on to the idea that they were making their way towards a boss battle that kept getting hard, that was going to keep getting harder and
Yeah.
harder and more ghoulish for them because they kept dying. And
That's brilliant.
it did help them avoid death, even though they knew, look, I can just be revivified back. I still don't want my character to die because I'm horrified at what we're about to face. And indeed, the final boss battle did wipe out 1/3 of the party. They were really I mean, and they didn't come back. It resurrected them as undead upon dying in a way that really sort of ended their possibilities of returning. But they respected it because they knew that their own actions were sort of built that encounter up.
So my 3-year-old has been asking what cemeteries are for. We'll drive past a cemetery and he'll be like, "What's that?" We'll be like, "It's a cemetery." He's like, "What's it for?" And last night, we were like, "Well, people die and you bury them under the ground there." And he's like, "Why do you bury them?" "Well, bodies break down eventually." And he's like, "So I'm gonna die?" And we're like, "Yeah, well, you're gonna die, but not for a very long time." He's like, "What about grandma and grandpa? Grandpa has all these bruises. Grandma has a hard time walking." "Well, yeah, they're gonna die too, but still not for a while, we hope." And I do think that the ritual of tabletop role-playing games is rehearsal and practice for our own deaths. And uh in that sense, it is a touchy subject within the game. But I do think ultimately it's one of the things that is a feature, a boon, a benefit of the hobby. But I also think for that same reason, perhaps, that is one of the reasons the nerfing of 5e and making it more combat as sport has led to its popularity, because it's there, it's in the back of your mind, but hey, there's all sorts of ways. It doesn't happen very often. There's all sorts of things you can do to prevent it, etc., etc., etc. Whereas the old school first edition, like sometimes you die and the bodies stack up like cordwood and you just have a new character roll out. Um, I mean, when I think of character deaths, because again, I don't play a ton of D&D, I play a lot of other games where it's not as easy to come back. And when I think of character deaths, people have stormed out of the house. People haven't talked for weeks after a character dies. There have been real sore feelings about it. Um, and again, it's not just it's not the same as a character in a video game. Although either of you ever play State of Decay?
No, I've
No.
not.
It's a zombie horror video game that fourth edition designer Andy Collins worked on. But in it, if your character dies, you cannot go back to a previous save and bring them back. They're just dead, and you need to move on with a new character.
Mm.
And I'm like, oh, that's brutal. So those may be my thoughts on that topic.
You
And
know, one thing I just want to, I know we're starting to run out of time. There's so much to say, right?
hey,
What
say more, Professor. It's why we're here.
Well, but just as this is a quick aside, and then I'll come back to the main thing. I'm a professional philosopher by training, and one of the things I love is hearing how early on we all become philosophical. I love that your son, was it your son? Is that
Yep, my
right?
son. Yep.
What are cemeteries for is both such an innocent but such a profoundly deep question, and it's because that there's so much there. You could go on answering that for quite some time. All right, I love it. We're all philosophical. We're born philosophical. Um, for what it's worth, the fifth edition, in my assessment, could be wrong. It was certainly not the first edition to become combat as sport. I mean, we get that, to my view, starting with the third. Actually, we start getting it, even though it's a terrible rule set. I think starting with the second edition. 3E brings it. 4E, my goodness, 4E sort of leans into it in a very specific way. I think the success of 5E is a complicated story about right timing with everything culturally going on. The Goldilocks rule set, it wasn't too much of one thing or another. People kept saying this
Ooh,
doesn't
that's
lead to
good.
one thing or another, and I was like, no, it's the Goldilocks rule set, right? It's the rule set that tried to be the Rosetta Stone.
I'm writing that down in my book notes, Professor. So watch out.
Okay. Oh, great,
The
great.
Goldilocks rule set. That's
Yeah,
amazing.
that's how I used to describe it all the time. It tried to be the Goldilocks rule set, a little bit, just enough of this, just enough of this, just enough of this. But it is to where we are at right now. It is a real challenge. I don't pick up Pathfinder 2 and expect anything other than a richly, wonderfully, mathematically sound resource management game, because I mean there's just so much going on in it. But the new fifth edition, as I've slowly been reading through it, or Tales of the Valiant, which I've also been reading through and playing, both of these go even further in giving players more and more to do round by round, to the point where you are getting players saying, "Oh, I forgot that I can do
Yeah.
this. I forgot that I can do this." And to me, once that's baked into the rules at a very fundamental level, it gets really hard to try to get them to stop looking at the
Yeah.
page, as it were,
Yes.
to work the problem as players rather than as just what their stats sheet
And
says.
this is what I'm not interested in with any edition. And don't get me wrong, I do like fifth edition. Yes, as we've talked about, I'm running Chris. I like fifth edition, all right, but it's interesting because I just started. It's my first Shadow Dark game that I started Thursday, and again, all the players in that game are coming from 5e, and I had there's that great I forgot I'm reminded there's a great that great little PDF that I think Matt Finch made called the
Oh,
Primer to Old School Role Playing,
love
which
that one.
yeah, if people haven't seen it, it's something to definitely take a look at because
It's Matt Finch.
Matt
Yeah.
Finch. Yeah, he's the one who
Swords and Wizardry, right? Matt Finch, right? Is it? Yeah.
I think, and he worked on Osric as well.
That's right.
But yeah, he was big in the retro clone community. But the primer for old school role playing, it's fantastic.
I'll put a link in the show notes.
Thank you, Ben. But one of the things that's so fascinating, and that exactly what you're describing is what I just don't like, is that I started this by saying one of the things that I liked was the concept that if this idea is that we're trying to make some way that we can take, the fantasy, pulp fantasy literature and make it ludic in some sense, that we can play within these stories and these mythologies and this folklore, is it gets lost a little bit when we're constantly looking at rules. It's kind of what we were talking about the vampire. Like, do we lose anything when we know exactly how many hit points a vampire has, rather than just saying, I want you to imagine what a vampire is. I want you to imagine what your barbarian is doing. Instead of saying, what can I do every round? Think about what a barbarian can do. And that comes up with, that's one of the things I think is great about Shadow Dark. I think the fewer rules you have, the less it gets that attention of the player onto the rules. And it also, I mean, it so much contextualizes the concept that this is a game rather than a session of make-believe. And definitely for the games, and again, I shouldn't say one system is better than the other, because they aren't. And I love playing games. I love playing crunchy games. But my favorite tabletop role-playing games are the games where it's really, like I've said this before, the thing that's revelatory about tabletop role-playing games isn't that there's a bunch of fantastic rules. The Advanced Dungeon Master's Guide, even though it's trying to create all these rules, I still think is still is contextualizing this concept as a social practice where where it's becoming socially legitimate that we can play make-believe with other adults. And that to me is all I want. I just want that legitimacy, that social permission to play make-believe. And I don't want it necessarily to become crunchy and mechanical, because I do think in some ways, I shouldn't say it limits that, but it does limit the kind of the boundaries of the imagination in some ways. It comes back to this concept of digitizing something that I want to stay analog. I want there to be more ambiguity. I want it to be more abstract. I want it to feel more like reading and less like playing Risk.
Huh.
Yeah, well, and for me, and I also love playing games, and that's why I I get frustrated with some of the more modern rule sets that lean heavy into the crunch, even though again, I play them. That's mostly what I play.
Yep.
I respect them. I love, but I play a ton of board games. So I
Hmm.
love it when I go into a board game of having, 1,000 things I have to think about and economic
Yes.
decisions to make. That's a great board game. I like video games, and I like looking at a screen and moving characters around the screen. And I like Baldur's Gate. But damn, when I sit down at the table for a tabletop role playing game, if it starts becoming just another board game, or if it starts becoming just another, video game, um, I don't know why I'm playing it. I'd rather play something else.
Yeah.
I've had players sometimes share with me. They say, "Well, Chris, it may not be fun for you as a dungeon master to have all these powers, but we love it." I say, "Great, but let me just tell you something. Um, Even as a player, I get frustrated with that because I've said in a lot of these things too. If I'm playing fifth edition, I have to memorize 1,000 rules once I hit eighth level to figure out what I can do smartly round by round. Um, I know again we maybe sound a little bit grumpy, but to me, since I do live in 5e land, I mean my players aren't leaving that anytime soon. I return to this challenge, which is really why I wanted us to have this conversation, which is how can I make some of the monsters of 5e sort of confront the players in a 1E sort of way without throwing all of 5E out the window, without asking them constantly to not use the powers that their characters have. It's a
Have
challenge. I don't expect there to be a straightforward answer.
have you read The Monsters Know What They're Doing?
I've not read The Monsters Know What They're Doing. Who wrote that? That sounds
Ah,
fascinating.
gosh, I can't. Christopher Amon, I believe his name is. It was a
Okay.
blog. It became a series of books. But when you're talking about 5e monsters with a 1e style, I would say check that out maybe because that might be what you're looking for. Um, but here we are at the end, and both of you just dropped these amazing bombs that I'd love to respond to. So let me see how quickly I can do that. I'm going to say, first of all, have either of you played Monty Cook's Cipher system?
I
I
have not.
have. Yeah.
Yeah, do you feel like that answers any of that need for the players having powers, but a simplicity for you at the table, or what'd you think?
I think really quickly that it is a great effort. There's so many efforts in this space now. I mean, that's one thing that we should try to end with. I mean, we're
Yeah,
focused on
Yeah.
5e, but
yeah.
I mean, the new Dagger Heart is probably going to lean into this a little bit as well, because that's Critical Role's attempt, I think, to sort of keep some of the crunchiness, but make it more narrative. So I'm curious to see what it comes up with. I think Cypher is a great thing. I think 13th Age. I'm really excited to see what 13th Age Second Edition does, because it also is trying to find this sweet spot. The real estate here is getting gobbled up in a lot of ways about what each new system is supposed to be sort of carving
Yeah.
out. Um, but I welcome experimenting with all of these. Monte Cook, I've always liked the work that he's done.
And Scott, D&D should be more like reading and less like playing Risk might be the title of the episode. Because gosh, like I certainly agree with that. Um, and
It's
go ahead, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, this is, I know that Shadow Dark's getting all the accolades, but one of the things that I really liked saying the other day to the 5e groups playing Shadow Dark for the first time is like, there's no skills in this game. You have a background, you know what your character's class is. If you want to do something, if you want to ride a horse, if you want to swim, if you want to suddenly build craft an item, actually, they probably are crafting rules, but I don't know what they are. If it makes sense with your background, you can do it. To me, I would much prefer to say that for just about everything, It's funny because I love second edition so much, but grognards will go, will spend all the day yelling at the non-weapon proficiency cloud, because that was the first way where we started
That was the
to
first, yeah.
mechanize things that had often been rather on the abstract sidelines. If you can do it, you don't have to roll anything to figure that you can, lead a charge. You're a fighter. That's what you do. I like that better.
All right, well, I can't believe it, but we've clocked through a whole hour again. Where does the time
Great
go?
conversation, really great conversations.
Yeah, this has been tremendously enjoyable. Professor, we'd love to have you on some other time, and not next week, but like some
Yeah, whenever you can stand me again, I love these chats. They're really wonderful. Yeah.
um so Scott, do you want to talk about Patreon today or should I?
Absolutely. Well, I can do it.
Okay.
Yeah. So we have a Patreon channel. The only way that we can keep this thing going, it's the only way. You so, help us, Obi-Wan Kenobi, our only hope. At any rate, we have a
Patreon
Patreon.
supporters, your only hope.
Yes, it's just $3 a month. So set aside, instead of buying that latte, support us. But most importantly, it allows you to have access to the Discord and a lot of the things that we talk about on these during these conversations. That we go a little bit deeper with the folks that are listeners. So again, the combat is war, combat is sport. I'm sure is going to come up in the Discord channel. But yeah, $3 a month allows you access to the Discord and also allows you access to some of the seminars and presentations that Ben has done. And we'll also get you, we've got Gamehole coming up, and we're doing this podcast live there. So if you're a Patreon member, you'll be able to get access to that as well.
I would also shout out that in September we will be releasing a new seminar of mine. I am not entirely certain which one we're going to be releasing yet, but I'm going to assume it's going to be the next juiciest one, which is what I titled The Battle for the Soul of D&D, which is essentially here's what all the people who were fired by Wizards have told me in the last 10 months. So if you are looking for juicy gossip, that is definitely a seminar that you'll want to hear. And the only way to hear that will be by subscribing to our Patreon. We will remind you again when it goes up, but that should be going up the first week of September. So that's coming up. So, hey, if you want to go and subscribe now, so you're all ready to get it the instant it drops, maybe you want to do that. So Professor, other than attending Harvard University, is there a way for our listeners to patronize you?
No, you can find me on Twitter. You can find me on Facebook. I do love these conversations, and I always do. I always do welcome them. Yeah.
I would tell you that I find your posts on Facebook to be enormously enlightening because you are a professor, obviously, of politics, right?
Yeah, I'm at the Kennedy School of Government, and for better or worse, that's we live and breathe politics. So my life.
Well, again, thank you so much for being on the show. With that, I will say, oh, good. So somebody's gonna say something.
I want to say I'm going to literally open up an entire big topic that I just want to throw out as a question because maybe the Discord folks can talk about it. But I'm so struck by we talked a little bit about philosophizing and this context of like how we feel about mortality and how it might leak into the games. I was just thinking how interesting is it to think about how the way that we run our games might change based on how our philosophies change. As we get older, I wonder if our games. I was just thinking so much around this concept of like, how does the way that we feel about mortality get into the game? Are we like less or more likely to lean into it as we get more terrified of potentially of our own mortality? How does that emerge through the way that we run our games? Again, we have no time to discuss that now, but maybe that's
Oh no,
something.
I'm gonna say something.
I love that. I'll plug if you don't mind. My last thought on this will be
Please.
I'm currently writing a book on Dungeons and Dragons ethics and leadership, but I edited a book, Dungeons and Dragons and Philosophy. There's actually two Dungeons and Dragons and Philosophy books out there. One's by Open Court, which is wonderful. That's not mine. But the other one's by Wiley Blackwell. That one is mine, big red cover. And in that edited volume, my chapter is Save versus Death, that explores this very question.
Oh my God. Okay.
So if you want to check it out, there it is. Yeah.
Who published that?
Wiley Blackwell.
Wiley Blackwell. Okay. And could you say the title of the book one more time?
It's Dungeons and Dragons and Philosophy.
Let me write down to provide a link.
This one you'll see it's a red cover that's very much a nod to the old basic set. Yeah.
All right. And since we're doing this, I'm gonna say this. I would say that I do not believe that there is life after death. And as I grow older in age, I actually find that I am less afraid of death than I was when I was younger, because I feel like I've kind of settled my cosmological business. I know what I think, and I'm living life every day. And death has gone from this idea that could inspire absolute panic at 2 a.m. When I'm alone in the dark in my bed, the kind of panic that would keep you up all night, to the feeling you get when you think about leaving a really good party. You're like, man, the party's only going to last so long, so I better do everything I can at this party, because this is it. This is the only party. This is all I get.
Ben, there is an afterlife, and it's just a bunch of tables with people playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Hey, if you are correct, I will be pleasantly surprised.
Forever.
If you are correct, I will be pleasantly surprised.
Well, I mean, if we're going to be a philosophy, what we're doing right now, I mean, the creation of reality is a tabletop role-playing game. It's all of us collaborating, sometimes competitively, sometimes cooperatively, to create a reality that we're all working on together. It's consensual collaboration of reality. So that, we're playing Dungeons and Dragons right now, both socially and through our quantum observations of the phenomena around us.
Hey, that might be the best 3 minutes on the whole internet. Way to go, guys. All right, now we're actually going to end this. So thank you, Professor Robichaud, for being here. I'm Ben Riggs.
I'm Dr. Scott Bruner.
Thank you so much. Much appreciated, Professor. And you have a good week, I assume, of school prep.
Yeah, I don't even want to talk about it. I'm in denial.